Just like the primordial Nereidus, nearly all of them encompass the ability to change shape at will. In Greece proper, the mountainous terrain sometimes formed impenetrable geographical barriers so that village settlements were often cut off from one another, often for extended periods of time. The implications were that regional folkloristic tradition concerning vampires and other supernatural beings didn't proliferate far and seldom intermingled with anything that may have been analogous in the neighbouring area. These independent branches eventually forged rich, a multifaceted substratum of collective beliefs around the core concept of what actually defined vampirism, yet simultaneously introduced the subtle problem of regional discrepancies. Thus, the actual time that these undead revenants rose from their graves came to be widely disputed. On the island of Thasos, for example, vampires only rose in the preternatural world of dreams, brought to fruition by sleep. Greeks living on the intermittent plains of the Greek state of Macedonia believed they arose on the night of the full moon. Alternatively, the islands of Samos and Mytilene in the North Aegean Sea alleged that vampires walked after midnight, but were restricted to the immediate vicinity of their graves. On Amoros, the easternmost of the Aegean Cycladic island group, vampires enjoyed an existence unfettered by the very circumstances detrimental to their survival by the northerners, i.e. time and spatial limits. They could walk about by day unencumbered by the very sunlight that was supposed to render them handfuls of dust. Nevertheless, all variant traditions agreed on the quintessential characteristic which defined all forms of vampirism. Vampires were filthy, ravenous predators who nurtured and spread contagion, murdered for the sadistic pleasure that the heinous act promulgated within them, incited pandemonium, and slathered about amidst the aftermath of any community depredation. They loitered about in inconspicuous areas, vandalizing village churches, defecating on consecrated grounds, and busied themselves with mischief until the first light of dawn. Like the unruly bloodsuckers confined to the nether regions of classical Hades, vampires periodically fed on freshly cut jugular veins to sustain their existence. Once in a while they might also stumble across raw liver, the vampiric equivalent of ribeye steak. The belief in these creatures of the dark became so pervasive that it evolved into mass hysteria and culminated in numerous public executions. Despite the doomsday scenario that the vampiric egregore cultivated during the latter Middle Ages, the Hellenes of Greece proper and the islands were not without defence. At this time, the ritual and ceremonial magic which had formed an essential component of the fertility religions of the pre-Christian world, which is known as Wicca, had withered from Western collective consciousness. Foremost in confounding its true meaning and purpose were the Church Fathers, who implemented their strict doctrines of conventional Christian theology. They aptly demoted the pagan practice, a denomination presided over by the devil and his minions, and consequently declared it a Christian heresy that both attracted to its practitioner the fate of eternal damnation and greatly augmented the chance of becoming a vampire. Fearing the implications of practical magic, the superstitious masses sought to ward off evil by brandishing mundane items or possessions of deep personal significance. Peasants resorted to nailing crosses made of reeds behind their doors, sealing keyholes with bread anointed with holy water from the local church, and spraying mustard seed on their roofs. Some went as far as to spear pieces of a pig's tongue to their porch door with a nail from a coffin. Million sailors and captains from the old capital of Castro appear to have devised more flamboyant and inventive forms to deter vampires from harassing them. They drew insulted open-hand gestures on their wooden doors, or they alternatively dug a 5-pointed star onto it before driving a black-handed knife through the star center. According to the Millian tradition, individuals born on a Saturday exhibit preeminence over all vampiric entities because their soul spark was jeweled. The spirit double could morph into a prodigious dog that would intimidate and chase the vampires away. Before the coming of Christianity to the area of Greece proper and the Slavonic immigration to the Balkan region of Europe, classical Hellenistic spirituality and eschatological belief laid the foundations for later vampiric folklore by hinting that the unclean spirit or demon could possess a decomposing body. The Greeks caused these undead revenants, or alestores, after the Hadean demon Alastor, who led humans to decadence and sin and then punished them for it. They were originally preternatural beings who functioned within the square of reason and logic, returning from the dimension of the afterlife to enact vengeance upon those who'd grievously sinned against them during the course of their lifetime. Herein, a mythological tenet outlines the psychic mechanism of higher consciousness, which delineates the ways of ethical and moral justice and its internal inherence within the whole of humankind. When these supernormal earth spirits became confounded with Christian demons, any benign or righteous qualities that rustics had previously ascribed to them fell away. The undead revenants then became obstreperous and vengeful tools used by Satan to further obstruct the Christian path to redemption. The arrival of Slavic law concerning werewolves or werebears and vampires enhanced the pre-existing Hellenic tradition, which extended from the northernmost regions of Macedonia to the southern Cyclavic islands of Milos and Santorini, as well as to distant Crete. In fact, the conviction in undead revenants was most potent in the southern Aegean, a region never subjugated by Slavonic influence. Thus it's highly probable that the Greeks only borrowed the name vampire from the Slavonic adaptation of a very pagan invention. These two very separate and distinct traditions, the Slavonic and the Greek, found a spirit ally in one another and had completely merged by the 17th century under the name of Rikolakas. After the hybrid entity stitched itself together by borrowing traits from both traditions, it discarded all its milder ones and paraded in the entrails of predation and hostility. Vampires were sentient beings, but without a slither of human conscience. They were wholly sinful and irrationally bloodthirsty. The Greek Orthodox Church saw this outrageous superstition as a perfect opportunity to tighten the reins on their religious monopoly. They became increasingly secular in a bid to consolidate terrestrial authority over the Greek-speaking Christian population. In the eyes of the Church Fathers, disobedience to the law of ecclesiastical doctrine was an evil heresy and was punishable by excommunication. Therefore, those who transgressed from the divinely appointed role that the Church credited to itself had been corrupted by the devil and were likely to become vampires. Interestingly, the desperation to maintain popular belief in this horrifying consequence of excommunication was so great that the Church unconsciously mounted an insurrection against its own teaching. By aiding and abetting mass hysteria and then repudiating accountability for it, the institution itself became an incarnation of the same intrinsic malevolence it was fighting to subdue. Nonetheless, it appears the belief subsisted until the late 18th century. On the island of Milos, it was predetermined that vampires went about their mischief during the week and rested on Saturdays. Similarly, the biblical creation account of the first chapter of Genesis explicates that Jehovah Elohim created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, the Sabbath or Saturday. This not only juxtaposes but identifies the Hebrew Yahweh with the amalgam of repugnant and deformed undead that became the very vessels through which the devil corrupted and tyrannized over human beings. Harking back to the last chapter, well, wouldn't be the last chapter, but it would be the last blog. It was established that the earliest heretical Christians, the Gnostics, had sprouted on Milos as early as the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. These sects fostered such contemptuous aversion towards Yahweh and his meaningful laws that they cast him in the role of an ignorant and conceited demon called Yaldabaoth. In knowledge of this, there is much credence to the notion that beliefs that pertain to the sphere of vampiric entities didn't arise randomly at all. Instead, they were an unconscious appropriation of Gnostic mythology, so psychically resident that relics were preserved in folk memory long after the self-declared orthodoxy of secular Christianity tried to decimate it. In 1897, vampires entered the sphere of popular literature with Bram Stoker's Dracula, a novel in which the protagonist is none other than a vampiric entity called Count Dracula. Vampires would go on to enter the literary genres of horror fiction, invasion literature, and the Gothic novel. One of my favourites in this style is The Travelling Vampire Show. It was written in 2000 by the late Richard Lehman. Just so happens that I am a huge Richard Lehman fan. I love his books. When it comes to the evolution of vampire literature, what most don't actually realise is that Dracula was actually influenced by a novella written by John Polidori, a doctor and close friend of Lord Byron. The novella, titled The Vampire, was published sometime between 1817 and 1819 and set the tone for both James Malcolm Rayner's Varney the Vampire, which was published in 1847, and Dracula, both works that came a great many decades afterwards. Thus, it appears that the Greeks played a role in the transmission of oral folklore about vampires to the West through the early literature of the 19th century. I will conclude today's lesson on Greek vampires with a quote from American writer Jack Handy, famous for his deep thoughts comedy sketches. And it is, one thing vampire children are taught is never run with a stake. And on that note, I will leave you to it, and I will catch you again for the next vlog. Have a good night.